September 1945. Tokyo lay in ashes. The war had ended just weeks ago, but the scars ran deeper than any bomb crater. Leland Whitmore, a 24-year-old farm boy from Iowa, stepped off the transport ship into a world he never imagined existed. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the skyline. Children with hollow eyes watched American soldiers from doorways. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the unfamiliar sense of a foreign land. Leland had been taught to see these people as enemies, yet standing among the ruins, all he saw was suffering. He clutched his rifle tighter, not from fear, but from the weight of what victory actually looked like. This was supposed to be the beginning of peace, but for thousands of Japanese civilians starving in the streets, it felt like the war had never ended. And for one young woman sorting through rubble to find anything sellable, it was about to become something entirely different. Fumiko Nakamura knelt beside what used to be her family home. 22 years old, university educated, fluent in English from her studies before the war, she now spent her days digging through debris. Her father had died in the firebombing of Tokyo. Her mother succumbed to illness 2 months after the surrender. Only her 15-year-old brother Takeshi remained, and keeping him fed meant swallowing pride daily. She worked at a distribution center where occupation forces handed out rations, translating for desperate civilians who bowed and begged for rice. The Americans looked at her differently than the other workers, some with suspicion, others with something worse. She kept her eyes down, did her job, and tried to remember the girl who once dreamed of becoming a teacher. Leland first noticed her on a Tuesday. She was translating for an elderly man who kept bowing, tears streaming down his weathered face. Her English was flawless, but her voice carried exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. When the old man finally received his ration, he pressed her hands in gratitude. She smiled, a brief flash of warmth that disappeared the moment he left. Leland found himself watching her throughout the week. She never asked for extra, never flirted with soldiers like some of the other workers. She simply translated, distributed supplies, and vanished the moment her shift ended. There was dignity in her movements, a quiet strength that reminded him of his mother back home, the way she carried the farm through the depression without ever complaining. It took Leland 3 weeks to find the courage to speak to her beyond official business. He waited until the distribution center closed, then approached with a chocolate bar, immediately feeling foolish. Fumiko looked at the offering, then at his face, searching for intentions. In broken Japanese he had been learning, Leland said he just wanted to talk. She almost refused. Fraternization with occupation soldiers was dangerous, socially devastating. But something in his nervous smile, the way he mangled her language with earnest effort, made her pause. They talked for 10 minutes that evening, then 20 minutes the next week, then an hour. He told her about cornfields stretching to the horizon. She told him about cherry blossoms in Ueno Park before the war. Neither mentioned that these conversations violated every unspoken rule between victor and vanquished. Captain Wendell Hartford noticed everything. A career military man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, he had seen dozens of his men develop attractions to Japanese women. Most were fleeting, transactions of loneliness and desperation. But Whitmore was different. The kid actually learned Japanese, brought books to read with her. Hartford had his orders: discourage fraternization, prevent marriages, maintain clear boundaries between occupiers and occupied. The official line was that these relationships undermined military discipline and American values. The unofficial truth was that Washington did not want thousands of Japanese wives flooding into a country that had spent 4 years demonizing them as subhuman monsters. Hartford watched Leland and Fumiko meet by the distribution center, talking like old friends, and felt the coming storm. By December 1945, Leland was in love. He had never felt anything like this back home. Not with Betty Sue, who everyone assumed he would marry, not with any of the girls at church socials. Fumiko challenged him. When he spoke about American superiority, she quietly asked if superior nations firebombed civilians. When he complained about cold rations, she reminded him that Japanese children were eating grass to survive. She was not bitter, just honest. And that honesty cut through every propaganda poster he had ever seen. They met in secret now, away from the distribution center. A park where skeletal trees stood guard. A quiet temple somehow untouched by bombs. He held her hand for the first time in January 1946, and she cried. not from happiness but from fear of what this meant. Fumiko knew the consequences. Japanese women seen with American soldiers were called pan-pan girls, prostitutes, traitors. Her neighbors already whispered. Takeshi, her brother, refused to speak to her for 2 weeks when he discovered her meetings with Leland. He was 15 and filled with rage at the country that had destroyed everything they knew. How could she betray their parents' memory? By loving an American. Fumiko had no answer that satisfied him. She only knew that Leland treated her like a human being when most of the world treated her like a defeated enemy. He asked about her dreams. He listened when she cried about her parents. He never demanded anything. In a world that had taken everything from her, he offered something she thought had died in the firebombing: hope. Leland wrote to his mother in February 1946. He told Dorothea Whitmore about Fumiko, carefully describing her education, her kindness, her strength. He did not mention she was Japanese until the 3rd paragraph, as if burying the fact might soften the blow. Dorothea's response arrived 6 weeks later. 3 pages of fury. How dare he disgrace the family name? How dare he forget that Japanese soldiers had killed his cousin at Pearl Harbor? How dare he bring shame upon his father's memory? She forbade the relationship. She threatened to disown him. She reminded him that Iowa had laws against mixed marriages, that no church would accept them, that he was throwing away his future for a woman who could never be accepted in decent society. Leland read the letter 3 times, then burned it. He had made his choice. Captain Hartford called Leland into his office in March 1946. The conversation was brief and brutal. Marriages between American servicemen and Japanese nationals were being strongly discouraged. The paperwork was deliberately complex. Even if approved, bringing a Japanese wife to America was nearly impossible under current immigration law. The Chinese Exclusion Act and Asian immigration restrictions remained in force. Hartford was not being cruel, just realistic. He had seen men court-martialed for less. He suggested Leland end the relationship before it destroyed his military career. Leland listened in silence, then asked if there was any legal way to marry Fumiko. Hartford sighed. Technically, yes, if Leland could navigate a bureaucratic maze designed to fail. The captain pulled out a stack of forms 6 inches thick. "Start here," he said, "and may God have mercy on your stubborn soul." The paperwork was indeed designed to discourage. Leland needed approval from his commanding officer, which Hartford reluctantly provided. He needed proof that Fumiko was not a war criminal or militant nationalist, requiring testimonials from multiple sources. He needed medical examinations for both of them. He needed documentation of her family background, nearly impossible when records had burned with the city. He needed proof of financial stability to support a wife. Each form led to 3 more. Each office sent him to another department. Japanese clerks looked at him with pity. American officers looked at him with contempt. One major asked him directly if he enjoyed betraying his race. Leland kept filing papers. Fumiko faced her own battles. Her brother Takeshi finally confronted her in their tiny rented room in April 1946. He was 16 now, working in a factory, the man of the family by default. He demanded she end this madness. They were Japanese. They had pride. Their parents would be ashamed. Fumiko let him rage, then spoke quietly. Their parents were dead. The war was over. Leland offered her a chance at life, at safety, at a future beyond digging through rubble. Was pride worth starving? Was nationalism worth dying alone? Takeshi had no answer. He left and did not return for 3 days. When he came back, he said nothing, but his silence was acceptance. He would not bless this union, but he would not stand in her way. By summer 1946, Leland and Fumiko had become part of a hidden community. Dozens of American servicemen were courting Japanese women, despite official discouragement. They met in secret, shared information about paperwork, warned each other about officers who reported fraternization. Some relationships were genuine love. Others were born from loneliness and convenience. But all faced the same wall of legal and social opposition. Fumiko met other Japanese women in her situation. Some had been disowned by their families. Others faced violence from nationalist groups who saw them as traitors. One woman was beaten so badly she lost sight in one eye. The message was clear. Loving the enemy had consequences. The War Brides Act passed in December 1945, but it initially excluded Asian wives due to existing immigration restrictions. Leland watched other soldiers bring home British, French, and Italian wives while Japanese women remained trapped. The injustice burned. America celebrated itself as the land of freedom while maintaining racist immigration laws that treated Asians as permanently foreign. It was not until the summer of 1947 that amendments finally allowed Japanese wives of American servicemen to enter the United States as non-quota immigrants. The paperwork Leland had been filing for over a year suddenly had a path forward. Captain Hartford called him in again, this time with something resembling respect. "You stubborn bastard," he said. "You actually might pull this off." Leland and Fumiko married in a small ceremony in Tokyo in August 1947. No family attended from either side. Captain Hartford served as witness, having quietly helped expedite paperwork when he could. A Japanese clerk who had processed their documents came, moved by their persistence. Fumiko wore a simple dress, not the white wedding kimono she had imagined as a girl. Leland wore his dress uniform, knowing it might be the last time he wore it with pride. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. They exchanged vows in English and Japanese. When the clerk pronounced them married, Fumiko became Fumiko Whitmore, a name that would mark her as foreign for the rest of her life. They spent their wedding night in a tiny apartment, listening to Tokyo's sounds, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Getting Fumiko to America took another 4 months of paperwork, medical examinations, and interviews. Immigration officials questioned her repeatedly, searching for any reason to deny entry. Was she a communist? Did she harbor resentment toward America? Could she assimilate into American society? Fumiko answered each question with careful English, knowing one wrong word could end everything. She was examined by doctors who treated her like a specimen. She was photographed and fingerprinted like a criminal. She signed documents promising to never become a public charge. The process was designed to humiliate, to make her prove she deserved to enter the country that had bombed her city. She endured it all with quiet dignity, thinking of the life waiting on the other side. Leland returned to Iowa in November 1947 to prepare for Fumiko's arrival. He had not seen his mother in over 2 years. Dorothea Whitmore stood on the farmhouse porch, older and grayer, her face hard as Midwest winter. She embraced her son briefly, then asked if he had come to his senses. Leland told her Fumiko would arrive in 3 weeks. Dorothea's face went white. She forbade Fumiko from entering her home. She told Leland he was no longer welcome if he insisted on this disgrace. Leland's younger sister stood in the doorway, crying. His uncle, who ran the farm now, would not meet his eyes. The town that had celebrated him as a war hero now whispered about him as a traitor to his race. Leland rented a small house on the edge of town and waited for his wife. Fumiko arrived in San Francisco in December 1947 with one suitcase and fear that threatened to choke her. She had never seen so many tall buildings still standing, never heard so much English spoken at once, never felt so utterly alone despite the crowds. Immigration processed her with barely concealed hostility. An officer asked her if she felt guilty about Pearl Harbor. She wanted to ask if he felt guilty about Hiroshima, but stayed silent. After 6 hours, they stamped her papers and released her into America. Leland waited outside, and when she saw him, she finally allowed herself to cry. He held her in the middle of the terminal while people stared and whispered. "Welcome home," he said. She nodded, unable to speak, knowing home was now a place that did not want her. The train ride to Iowa took 3 days. Fumiko watched America pass by the window, vast and alien. Towns that looked identical, farmland stretching forever. People who stared at her in station cafes, their faces ranging from curiosity to open hostility. In Nebraska, a waitress refused to serve her until Leland threatened to call the manager. In Illinois, a man spit at her feet and called her a Jap. Leland stood between her and the world, but he could not shield her from everything. She began to understand what her life would be. Not violence, perhaps, but endless small cruelties. 1,000 paper cuts of prejudice that would bleed her slowly. Their house in Iowa was small but clean. Leland had prepared everything, buying furniture with his military savings, stocking the kitchen, hanging curtains. Fumiko walked through the rooms, touching surfaces, trying to make them feel real. Through the window, she could see farmland and distant houses. Somewhere out there was Leland's family, who refused to meet her. Somewhere out there was a town that saw her as the enemy. She unpacked her single suitcase, hanging her few dresses in the closet, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. That night, Leland held her while she cried, promising it would get better. She wanted to believe him. The town of Millbrook, Iowa, had 3,000 residents, one main street, 2 churches, and no place for a Japanese woman. Fumiko's first trip to the general store was an education in American prejudice. Conversation stopped when she entered. Women clutched their purses tighter. The clerk served her last after every white customer and counted her change twice as if she might steal. No one spoke to her directly. They spoke about her, loud enough to hear. There's the Jap girl Whitmore brought back. Shame what the war did to some of our boys. Wonder if she's here to spy. Fumiko bought flour and sugar and left with her head high, but her hands shook all the way home. Church was worse. Leland had attended Millbrook Methodist since childhood. He brought Fumiko on Sunday, believing faith might bridge the divide. The congregation stared as they entered. Families shifted in pews to avoid sitting near them. The pastor's sermon that day was about forgiveness, but his eyes kept darting to Fumiko, and his words felt pointed. After the service, elderly women who had known Leland since birth refused to shake Fumiko's hand. One woman, Mildred Kerrigan, told Leland directly that bringing a Japanese woman into God's house was disrespectful to the boys who died fighting them. Leland took Fumiko's hand and walked out. They never returned. Dorothea Whitmore maintained her boycott. She lived 3 miles away but might as well have been on another planet. Leland visited alone once a week, trying to build a bridge. Each visit ended the same way. Dorothea demanded he send Fumiko back to Japan. Leland refused. Dorothea cried about the grandchildren she would never acknowledge. Leland left angry. His sister wrote him letters begging for compromise, but there was no middle ground between acceptance and rejection. By spring 1948, Leland stopped visiting. If his mother wanted a relationship, she knew where to find him. Fumiko learned to navigate her isolation. She planted a garden, growing vegetables with techniques from Japan. She learned to bake bread from a cookbook, teaching herself American cooking through trial and error. She wrote letters to Takeshi in Tokyo, careful not to reveal how hard life was, sending money when she could. She studied English from the radio, eliminating her accent, trying to sound more American. She sewed her own clothes because the dress shop in town refused to serve her. She built a life from scraps, just as she had in Tokyo after the war, surviving through quiet determination. Leland found work at a factory 30 miles away, driving each day before dawn. The pay was less than he deserved, but farms would not hire him anymore. His uncle made it clear that a man married to a Japanese woman was not welcome on family land. Co-workers at the factory treated him with suspicion at first, but his work ethic eventually won grudging respect. They did not invite him for beers after shifts. They did not ask about his wife, but they worked beside him, and that was something. He came home exhausted each night to find Fumiko had created small miracles. A perfectly cooked meal, freshly laundered clothes, a house that felt like home despite the hostile world outside. Their first year in Iowa was survival. No friends, no family, just 2 people against a community determined to reject them. But small cracks appeared in the wall. The postmaster, an elderly man who had lost his son at Guadalcanal, started greeting Fumiko by name. A farmer's wife whose husband had died in the war began nodding to her at the store. These were not friendships, just acknowledgments of shared humanity. But they mattered. Fumiko collected these small kindnesses like precious stones, proof that not everyone saw her as the enemy. In March 1949, Fumiko discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror. Bringing a child into this hostile world felt impossibly difficult. But Leland was overjoyed, already imagining a son or daughter who would bridge 2 cultures. They told no one at first, keeping the secret between them. But as Fumiko's belly grew, hiding became impossible. The town's reaction was mixed. Some saw the pregnancy as proof that Leland had been seduced by foreign temptation. Others saw a baby as something innocent, separate from war and prejudice. Dr. Harrison, who had delivered half the town, agreed to take Fumiko as a patient, though his nurse made her wait in a separate room from white mothers. Their daughter was born in November 1949. They named her Grace, hoping she would find the acceptance they had not. Grace was beautiful, with Leland's light brown hair and Fumiko's delicate features, a perfect blend of 2 worlds. Leland held her in the hospital and wept. Fumiko looked at her daughter and felt purpose crystallize. This child would not grow up ashamed. This child would know both cultures. This child would prove that love could transcend hate. When they brought Grace home, Fumiko wrote to Takeshi, now 19, and studying at university. "You are an uncle," she wrote. "Our family continues despite everything." Dorothea Whitmore heard about her granddaughter through town gossip. For 3 weeks, she said nothing. Then, on a cold December morning, she appeared at Leland's door. She did not apologize. She did not embrace Fumiko. She simply asked to see the baby. Fumiko brought Grace to the door, and Dorothea stared at the infant for a long moment. The baby looked like Leland, as a newborn. Dorothea's hands trembled. She asked if she could hold her. Fumiko hesitated, then placed Grace in her grandmother's arms. Dorothea held the baby for 5 minutes without speaking, tears running down her weathered face. Then she handed Grace back, nodded to Fumiko, and left. It was not reconciliation, but it was a beginning. The 1950s brought slow, painful progress. Dorothea began visiting once a month, always briefly, always awkward. She brought gifts for Grace but rarely spoke to Fumiko. Fumiko accepted this partial acceptance, understanding that changing hearts took time. Grace grew into a bright, curious toddler who called her grandmother Nana and slowly melted the ice around Dorothea's heart. By 1952, Dorothea stayed for dinner occasionally. By 1953, she helped Fumiko with canning vegetables. They did not discuss the past. They did not become friends. But they became family, slowly and carefully. Mildred Kerrigan remained Fumiko's harshest critic. The woman who had condemned her at church led a social boycott, ensuring Fumiko was excluded from every community event. When Grace started school in 1955, Mildred tried to have her placed in a separate classroom, arguing that mixed-race children would distract white students. The principal refused, but the damage was done. Grace came home crying, asking why Mrs. Kerrigan said her mother was a bad person. Fumiko held her daughter and explained as simply as possible that some people could not let go of the war. Grace asked if they would ever forgive. Someday, Fumiko said, not believing it. But forgiveness came from an unexpected place. In winter 1956, Mildred Kerrigan's husband had a heart attack while shoveling snow. Fumiko saw him collapse from her window. She ran outside without a coat, performing rescue breathing she had learned in Japan during the war. She kept him alive until Dr. Harrison arrived. Mildred watched from her porch as the Japanese woman she had spent 8 years hating saved her husband's life. When he recovered, Mildred came to Fumiko's door. She did not apologize for the years of cruelty. She simply said thank you and asked if Fumiko would teach her to make the beautiful paper cranes she had seen hanging in the window. Fumiko invited her in. The friendship between Fumiko and Mildred was unlikely and imperfect. Mildred never fully shed her prejudices, and Fumiko never forgot the cruelty. But they found common ground in gardening, recipes, and eventually, honest conversations about the war. Mildred admitted she had blamed all Japanese people for her brother's death at Iwo Jima. Fumiko told her about losing her parents in the firebombing. They cried together, 2 women who had been enemies discovering shared grief. Mildred began defending Fumiko in town, shutting down gossip, inviting her to church events. Slowly, painfully, Millbrook began to accept what it could not change. Leland and Fumiko had 2 more children, a son, Thomas, born in 1953, and another daughter, Helen, born in 1956. Each birth made them more rooted in Iowa, more permanent, harder to ignore. The children grew up bilingual, speaking English in public and Japanese at home. Fumiko taught them about their heritage, cooking Japanese meals, celebrating Japanese holidays, ensuring they knew where half their blood came from. Leland supported this, understanding that denying Fumiko's culture would be another kind of violence. Their home became a small island of 2 worlds, imperfect, but theirs. The 1960s brought cultural change that slowly vindicated Leland's choice. The civil rights movement challenged American racism directly. Laws against interracial marriage began falling, though Iowa's anti-miscegenation statute had not been enforced in years. Television brought the world into living rooms, making foreign cultures less frightening. Younger generations questioned their parents' prejudices. Grace, Thomas, and Helen grew up in a slightly more tolerant world than their parents had known. Not perfect, not equal, but better. By 1965, Dorothea had fully embraced her grandchildren and grudgingly her daughter-in-law. She admitted to Fumiko, during a quiet moment while canning peaches, that she had been wrong. She had let hate and fear override love. She had wasted years that could have been spent knowing this woman who had made her son happy. Fumiko accepted the apology with grace, understanding the courage it took. They would never be close, their relationship forever marked by those early years of rejection. But they were family. Dorothea died in 1968, holding Fumiko's hand. Her last words an apology for not being better. Takeshi visited America in 1970, his first trip since the war. He was 40 years old now, a professor of English literature in Tokyo, married with children of his own. He met his nieces and nephew, these half-American children who spoke Japanese with funny accents. He met Leland, the man he had once hated, and found a gentle soul who loved his sister deeply. He saw how Fumiko had built a life from nothing, how she had endured and prevailed. On his last night, he told Leland that he had been wrong to oppose the marriage. Leland had given Fumiko something Japan could not at the time: hope. Leland replied that Fumiko had given him something Iowa never could: perspective. The years passed. Leland retired from the factory in 1985. Fumiko became a beloved figure in Millbrook, teaching Japanese cooking classes at the community center, helping at the library, volunteering at the school. The woman who had been rejected by the church became its most dedicated charity worker. Young people who had grown up seeing her as part of the community could not imagine why anyone had ever objected to her presence. The war became history, then distant history, then something studied in books. New immigrants arrived in Iowa, Latinos and Hmong refugees, and Fumiko helped them navigate the same prejudice she had faced, offering guidance and solidarity. Grace became a teacher, Thomas a lawyer, Helen a nurse. All married, all had children of their own. The Whitmore family expanded into a network of cultures and backgrounds. Thanksgiving dinners included both turkey and Japanese dishes. Christmas meant both Christian carols and Japanese traditions. The grandchildren grew up not understanding why anyone would think their grandmother being Japanese was strange. To them, she was just grandma, who made the best mochi and told stories about old Tokyo and always had hard candy in her purse. Leland's health began failing in his 80s. Fumiko cared for him with the same determination she had brought to everything else. She learned medical procedures, managed medications, refused to let him go to a nursing home. He joked that she had saved him twice, once from loneliness in Tokyo and now from dying alone. In 2015, on their 68th wedding anniversary, Leland told her that bringing her home was the best decision he ever made. Fumiko, 92 years old and still sharp, replied that coming home was the scariest and best decision she ever made. They sat on their porch, holding hands, watching the Iowa sunset, two people who had defied the world and won. Leland died in February 2018 at the age of 97. His funeral was attended by hundreds. Veterans honored his service. Community members honored his courage. His children and grandchildren honored his love. Fumiko sat in the front row, surrounded by family, and did not cry. She had cried enough over 70 years. Now she simply remembered. The young soldier who had been kind when kindness was rare. The man who had defied his country, his family, and his culture for her. The husband who had never once made her feel like a burden. She placed a cherry blossom on his casket, a piece of Japan accompanying him to rest in Iowa soil. Fumiko lived 2 more years. She spent them surrounded by the family she and Leland had created against all odds. She told her story to a local historian, wanting it preserved. She wanted people to know what it cost to love across enemy lines. She wanted young people to understand that the freedoms they enjoyed had been won by individuals who refused to accept unjust limitations. She wanted Leland's courage remembered. In her final interview, she said something that would be quoted in her obituary. "America had no place for me in 1945, but one man made a place. That is what love does. It makes space where none existed." Fumiko Whitmore died in March 2020 at the age of 97. Her obituary listed 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren. It mentioned her volunteer work, her cooking classes, her role in making Millbrook a more welcoming community. It noted that she was one of thousands of Japanese war brides who had come to America after World War II, facing prejudice and legal barriers, yet building lives and families that enriched the nation. Her funeral was delayed due to the COVID pandemic, but when it finally occurred, the church was full. Mildred Kerrigan's daughter spoke about how Fumiko had taught her mother to see beyond hate. Grace spoke about growing up between two cultures and feeling blessed by both. Thomas read a letter from relatives in Japan, thanking America for giving their aunt a home. The story of Leland and Fumiko Whitmore is not unique. Approximately 45,000 Japanese women married American servicemen between 1945 and 1965, coming to a country that had no legal framework for them, no social acceptance, and often, no welcome from their husbands' families. They faced the Chinese Exclusion Act, anti-miscegenation laws in communities that saw them as enemy aliens. Many marriages failed under the pressure. Many women returned to Japan, defeated by isolation and prejudice. But many stayed, raised families, and slowly changed America by their presence. They worked as translators, teachers, and cultural ambassadors. They opened restaurants, taught language classes, and built bridges between nations that had been at war. Their children and grandchildren became doctors, lawyers, artists, and soldiers, contributing to American society while maintaining connections to Japanese heritage. These women were pioneers of a sort America did not want. They proved that legal barriers were not moral barriers. They demonstrated that love could transcend propaganda. They showed that the enemy was never as simple as wartime posters suggested. Every Japanese war bride who successfully built a life in America was a small revolution against racism, nationalism, and the idea that some people were permanently foreign. They did not march or protest. They simply lived, raised families, and refused to be erased. Their legacy is visible in the thousands of mixed heritage families across America, in the acceptance of interracial marriage, in the understanding that American identity is not defined by race. The legal barriers that made Leland and Fumiko's marriage so difficult began falling in the decades after the war. The War Brides Act of 1945 was amended in 1947 to include Japanese and other Asian wives. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 finally ended Asian exclusion, though quotas remained discriminatory. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 challenged systemic racism. Loving vs. Virginia in 1967 struck down all remaining anti-miscegenation laws. Each legal victory was won by individuals who had refused to accept injustice, by couples who married despite the law, by families who existed in defiance of prejudice. Leland and Fumiko were part of that larger movement, though they never thought of themselves as activists. They were just two people who loved each other. The cultural impact of Japanese war brides extended beyond their immediate families. They introduced Japanese food to American tables decades before sushi became mainstream. They taught Americans about Buddhism, Shinto, and Eastern philosophy. They maintained connections between the United States and Japan during the Cold War, writing letters, sending gifts, facilitating understanding between former enemies. When Japan became an economic powerhouse in the 1980s, many Americans had personal connections through these families, making the relationship less threatening. The war brides were unintentional diplomats, their marriages creating people-to-people bonds that governments could not forge. In Millbrook, Iowa, there is now a small plaque in the community center honoring Fumiko Whitmore's contributions to the town. It mentions her volunteer work, her cultural education efforts, and her role in making the community more inclusive. It does not mention the years she was excluded from that same community center. It does not mention the boycotts, the slurs, the rejection. History has been softened, made palatable, but Grace Whitmore made sure the full story was preserved in the local Historical Society archives. She donated her mother's letters, photographs, and the detailed diary Fumiko kept during her first decade in America. Future generations will know the truth. Acceptance was not given freely. It was earned through decades of dignity in the face of cruelty. The lesson of Leland and Fumiko Whitmore is not that love conquers all. Love did not eliminate racism in Iowa. It did not erase the trauma of war. It did not make Fumiko's journey easy. But love gave them the strength to endure. It gave Leland the courage to defy his family and culture. It gave Fumiko the resilience to build a life in a hostile land. It gave their children the foundation to navigate two worlds. Love was not magic. It was work, daily and difficult, choosing each other when the world said they should not. That choice, repeated over 70 years, created a family, changed a community, and added one more thread to the complex tapestry of American identity. Today, interracial marriage in America is common and largely accepted. Approximately 17% of newlyweds marry someone of a different race or ethnicity. The legal barriers are gone. The social stigma has diminished significantly. Young people cannot imagine a time when marrying across racial lines was illegal, when families disowned children for loving the wrong person, when communities boycotted interracial couples. But that time was not distant history. It was Leland and Fumiko's reality. It was the world they challenged by simply insisting on their right to love each other. Every interracial couple today walks a path made slightly easier by those who came before, who endured the worst of prejudice so the next generation would face less. The story of Japanese war brides is ultimately about the failure of hate to be permanent. America in 1945 was deeply racist, with laws and customs designed to keep races separate. The idea of white soldiers marrying Japanese women was seen as a betrayal, a pollution of racial purity, a threat to national identity. Yet thousands of soldiers made that choice anyway, and thousands of Japanese women accepted the risk of coming to a hostile country. Over time, the children of these marriages became teachers, doctors, and community leaders. The grandchildren became so integrated that their Japanese heritage was just one part of their identity, not a mark of foreignness. The great-grandchildren often barely know the story of how their families began. Hate could not sustain itself across generations when confronted with the humanity of actual people. Fumiko's story also highlights the specific experience of women in war and its aftermath. While Leland faced disapproval for his choice, Fumiko faced existential threat. She was called traitor by some Japanese for marrying an American. She was called enemy by some Americans for being Japanese. She navigated both cultures as an outsider, belonging fully to neither. The burden of the marriage fell disproportionately on her. She left her country, her language, her culture. She adapted to American food, American customs, American expectations. She learned English perfectly, while Leland's Japanese remained basic. She endured the daily microaggressions while he went to work. This is the reality for many immigrant women in cross-cultural marriages. They bear the weight of adaptation. Yet Fumiko was not simply a victim. She made active choices. She chose to marry Leland knowing the consequences. She chose to come to America despite the risks. She chose to stay when she could have returned to Japan. She chose to raise her children with pride in both cultures. She chose to forgive the community that rejected her. She chose to help later immigrants facing similar struggles. Her agency matters. The story is not about a white man saving a helpless Japanese woman. It is about two people making difficult choices together, supporting each other through consequences, and building something meaningful from the wreckage of war. The Whitmore family represents a larger truth about American identity. It is constantly being renegotiated. Each wave of immigration, each interracial marriage, each cultural fusion changes what it means to be American. In 1945, being American meant being white, Christian, and English-speaking to many people. Japanese war brides and their families expanded that definition. They proved that American identity could include Japanese heritage, that loyalty was not determined by race, that families could span cultures. This expansion happened family by family, community by community, generation by generation. It was not smooth or easy, but it was inevitable once people like Leland and Fumiko insisted on their right to exist. The COVID pandemic that delayed Fumiko's funeral was a cruel irony. She had survived the firebombing of Tokyo, the starvation of post-war Japan, the journey to a hostile country, and decades of prejudice. She lived to see her great-grandchildren, to witness the election of a black president, to see Japanese culture celebrated in America. Then a virus ended her life just as it ended millions of others. A reminder that even the strongest eventually fall to forces beyond their control. But her legacy was secure. The family she and Leland created would continue. The community she helped change would remember. The story she insisted on telling would be preserved. If you visit Millbrook, Iowa today, you will find a typical Midwest town. Main Street has the usual shops. The Methodist Church still stands. Farmland surrounds everything. But if you look closely, you will find traces of Fumiko's presence. The community center offers Japanese language classes. The annual cultural festival includes Japanese food and performances. The library has a section on Asian American history that Fumiko helped establish. These are small things, easily overlooked, but they represent a fundamental shift. Millbrook is not the same town that rejected Fumiko in 1947. It changed because she refused to leave, refused to hide, refused to be anything other than herself. The broader historical context matters. Japanese war brides came to America during a specific moment, after a brutal war, before the civil rights movement, when racism was legally sanctioned and socially accepted. They arrived as the United States was beginning to grapple with its own contradictions, claiming to be a land of freedom while maintaining segregation and discrimination. These women and their families became part of the pressure that eventually forced change. They were not the only factor, not even the main factor, but they contributed to the growing evidence that racial barriers were unjust and ultimately unsustainable. Every successful interracial family was proof that the fears underlying segregation were unfounded. Leland's role in this story is also significant. He was not a progressive activist or a radical. He was a farm boy from Iowa who served his country and fell in love. But he made a choice that was radical in its context. He refused to accept that race should determine who he could love. He defied his mother, his community, and his culture. He endured social ostracism and economic consequences. He never wavered. This is important because it shows that challenging injustice does not require being a hero or a saint. It requires ordinary people making difficult choices and standing by them. Leland was ordinary in most ways, but his choice was extraordinary in its impact. The children of Japanese war brides faced their own unique challenges. They were mixed race in a society that believed in racial purity. They were neither fully white nor fully Asian in communities that demanded clear categories. They faced prejudice from both sides. Too Japanese for white America, too American for Japanese relatives. Many struggled with identity, trying to figure out where they belonged. But many also found strength in their dual heritage, drawing from both cultures, creating new ways of being American. They became translators in the literal and figurative sense, helping both sides understand each other. Grace Whitmore, Leland and Fumiko's eldest daughter, became an advocate for mixed-race families and multicultural education. She wrote a memoir about growing up between two worlds, describing both the pain and the privilege of her experience. She worked with schools to develop curriculum that acknowledged Asian American contributions to history. She spoke at conferences about the Japanese war bride experience. She made sure her mother's story was not forgotten. In doing so, she honored both her parents, her father's courage and her mother's resilience. She proved that the next generation could take the foundation their parents built and create something even stronger. The story of Japanese war brides is also a story about the consequences of war. World War II killed millions, destroyed cities, and traumatized entire populations. But it also brought people together who would never have otherwise met. Leland would never have gone to Japan without the war. Fumiko would never have met an American without the occupation. Their love story was born from destruction. This does not justify war, but it acknowledges that even from terrible things, human connections can emerge. The war brides were an unintended consequence of conflict, a reminder that people will find ways to connect even when governments tell them they are enemies. As of 2025, most Japanese war brides have passed away. They were young women in the 1940s, which means even the youngest are now in their 90s or have died. Their generation is disappearing, taking their direct memories with them. This makes preserving their stories urgent. Organizations like the Japanese American National Museum have collected oral histories, photographs, and documents. Families like the Whitmores have donated archives. Historians have written books and produced documentaries, but much has been lost. Many war brides never told their stories, carrying the pain privately. Many families did not preserve documents. The full scope of their experience will never be fully known. What remains is the evidence of their impact, the thousands of families they created, the cultural exchange they facilitated, the legal barriers they helped break down, the proof that love can transcend hate. These are not small things. They represent a fundamental shift in American society, from a nation that legally excluded Asians to one that celebrates diversity. The shift was not linear or complete. Prejudice remains. But the direction of change is clear, and Japanese war brides were part of the force that pushed America toward its ideals rather than its fears. Fumiko's final words to her family were characteristically practical. She told them not to mourn too long, to remember the good times, to take care of each other. She told Grace to finish the memoir project. She told Thomas to keep fighting for immigrant rights in his legal work. She told Helen to continue her work as a nurse, caring for people regardless of their background. She told her grandchildren to be proud of their heritage, all parts of it, and she asked that when they thought of her, they remember not just the hardships, but the joy of building a family with Leland, the joy of watching her children succeed, the joy of seeing her grandchildren grow, the joy of a life fully lived despite everything. So if you are asked to remember Japanese war brides, remember this. They were young women who made impossible choices. They came to a country that did not want them and built lives anyway. They faced rejection, prejudice, and isolation, yet they persevered. They raised children who became bridges between cultures. They changed communities by their presence. They proved that legal barriers and social prejudice could not stop love or family. They were ordinary women who did extraordinary things simply by insisting on their right to exist, to love, and to belong. Their legacy is in every interracial family, every multicultural community, every person who believes that American identity is defined not by race but by shared values and dreams. America had no place for Japanese war brides in 1945, yet thousands of soldiers brought their wives home anyway. In doing so, they changed what America was and what it could become. They proved that the nation's ideals of freedom and equality were not just words, but possibilities that could be realized by ordinary people making courageous choices. Leland and Fumiko Whitmore were two of those people. Their story is American history, not as taught in textbooks but as lived by real people facing real consequences. It is a story of love, courage, resilience, and the slow, difficult work of building a more inclusive society. It is a story that deserves to be remembered. So remember Fumiko, standing in the ruins of Tokyo, choosing hope over despair. Remember Leland, defying his country and family for love. Remember their children, navigating two worlds. Remember Dorothea, learning to let go of hate. Remember Mildred, discovering shared humanity. Remember Millbrook, slowly opening its heart. Remember that change happens person by person, family by family, generation by generation. Remember that America is not a fixed identity, but a constant negotiation, shaped by everyone who insists on belonging. Remember that love, while not magic, is powerful enough to challenge empires, change laws, and create families that should not exist according to the rules of their time. Remember, and in remembering, honor the courage it took to love across enemy lines. Now I want you to hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and drop a comment below telling me what you think about this incredible story of love against all odds.